Close your eyes for a second and remember what it felt like to be bored. Really bored. Not scrolling through your phone seeing nothing bored. Not refreshing the same 3 apps bored. I mean the kind of boredom where time moved like syrup. Where a Saturday afternoon in July stretched out so long you could feel the texture of it. Where you lay on the carpet and stared at the ceiling and there was nothing to do and no way to fix it and you just sat in it. You waited for the phone to ring. You rewound the same cassette tape 17 times. You knew what the walls of your room looked like in a way no one knows the walls of their room anymore. You remember the sound, don't you? The hum of a house with no screens. The refrigerator. Your mom talking on the phone in the kitchen, the cord stretched across the doorway. The sound of someone you missed and couldn't text, couldn't call because it was long distance and it cost money. You just had to carry the missing until you saw them again. And you probably haven't thought about this in years, but somewhere in your body, you still know what it felt like to wait for the dial-up tone. That sequence of beeps and static that meant you were about to enter a different world. You'd sit there, waiting, watching the little loading bar, and you didn't refresh. You didn't close the tab and open a new one. You just waited, because that's what you knew how to do. You were taught patience by a world that didn't move at the speed of now. If you were born between 1976 and 1985, you lived through something no generation before or after will ever experience. You had an analog childhood and a digital adulthood. And the transition didn't happen slowly. It happened right in the middle of the most crucial developmental window your brain will ever have. This isn't a nostalgia video. This is about what happened to your nervous system, your attention span, your sense of identity, your ability to be alone. Because you didn't just live through a technological shift, you lived through a cognitive rewiring, and it shaped the way you see the world in ways you've never put words to. Let's start where it actually started. You grew up in a world that required you to remember things. Phone numbers, addresses, the route to your friend's house. You couldn't pull up a map, you couldn't Google the answer. If you forgot, you were stuck. So your brain built different pathways, stronger ones. The kind of memory that doesn't live in your phone. It lives in you. You also grew up with privacy in a way that doesn't exist anymore. When you were upset, when you were figuring something out, when you made a mistake or said something you regretted, it stayed in the room. It didn't get screenshotted. It wasn't posted. There was no permanent record of who you were at 14. You got to try on different versions of yourself in private, quietly, without an audience, without anyone weighing in, without the internet having an opinion about it. And that gave you something rare, the ability to have an internal life that belongs only to you. But more than anything, you grew up learning to wait. You waited for Saturday morning cartoons. You waited for the radio to play the song you wanted so you could record it. You waited for photos to be developed. You waited for letters, for phone calls, for people to just show up because that's how plans worked. You said you'd meet at the mall at 3 p.m., and if someone didn't show, you waited. And if they still didn't show, you went home. There was no text saying, running late. You just didn't know. And psychologically, this did something important. It taught you that discomfort doesn't need to be immediately resolved, that uncertainty is survivable, that not everything needs to be instant. It built a tolerance for delay that became foundational to how your brain processes reward, patience, and emotional regulation. Your attention span was trained by depth, not breadth. You finished books. You watched whole movies without pausing. You had conversations without checking your phone because you didn't have a phone to check. You were present by default because presence was the only option. And your sense of identity formed slowly, in private, through trial and error that no one was watching. This is what built the foundation. And then, right as you were transitioning into adulthood, everything changed. It didn't happen gradually. One year you were using a payphone, the next year you had AIM. You had an email address. You had a cell phone that could only make calls. And then suddenly, it could take photos. And then it could access the internet. And then the internet was everywhere. And it never turned off. And this transition, This complete inversion of how information, communication, and connection worked happened while you were between 18 and 25, which means it happened while your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for decision making, impulse control, long-term planning, identity, was still forming. Your brain was still plastic, still wiring itself, still figuring out who you were and how the world worked. And in the middle of that process, the rules changed. You had to learn two completely different operating systems for being human, and not sequentially, simultaneously. You had to hold the old model and the new model in your mind at the same time and figure out when to use which one. You learned to write emails and cover letters with the formality of letters, but texts with the speed and casualness of speech. You learned that some things should be said in person, and some things could be said over text, and if you got it wrong, the consequences were real. You became bilingual in a way no one else is. You can navigate a world with no GPS, but you also know how to use GPS. You can make small talk at a party, but you also know how to Google someone before you meet them. You remember what it was like to lose touch with people, really lose them, with no way back. So you value the few people you stayed close to. But you also understand how to maintain weak ties digitally in ways that previous generations never had to. You can hold a conversation without needing to look something up, but you also know how to fact-check in real time. And this cognitive bilingualism is so specific to you that people on either side of you don't fully have it. Gen X didn't experience the transition during peak neuroplasticity. They adapted, but the foundation was already set. Millennials were younger, their brains wired digitally from the start. But you? You were split right down the middle, half formed in one world, finished in another. And that created something unusual, a kind of cognitive flexibility that isn't the same as being good with technology. It's deeper than that. It's the ability to switch between two completely different ways of processing the world and to understand both. You can be alone without being lonely because you learned that before phones made being alone impossible. But you also understand connection in the digital sense because you lived through the moment it became possible. You exist in the overlap. And you've been living in that overlap your entire adult life. And then, just as you were starting to figure out how to be an adult in this new world, the economy collapsed. 2008. For a lot of you, that was the moment you were supposed to be entering stability, buying a house, starting a career, building something. Instead, you entered a recession. Jobs disappeared. Entire industries restructured. The promises that were made to you about how adulthood was supposed to work turned out to be negotiable. And this didn't just affect your bank account. It affected your nervous system. When instability happens early in your adult life, it rewires how you perceive risk, how you plan for the future, how much you trust systems. You learned, very quickly, that things that seem solid can vanish, that doing everything right doesn't guarantee security. So you became adaptable, not because you wanted to, because you had to. You learned to hold multiple income streams, to not rely too heavily on one thing, to keep options open, to be skeptical of grand promises. And this, combined with everything else you'd already lived through, to create a very specific kind of person. Someone who doesn't trust easy answers. Someone who can pivot. Someone who learned young that the world doesn't owe you anything, but that doesn't mean you stop trying. It just means you stop expecting it to be easy. You didn't just survive one crisis. You were shaped by several, each one arriving at a moment when you were still figuring out who you were and how the world worked. And each one taught you the same lesson. Flexibility is survival. Trust nothing completely. Build your own safety net because the one they promised you doesn't exist. This wasn't the life you were told to expect, but it's the one you learned to navigate. And that navigation rewired you in ways that younger generations won't understand until their own version of 2008 arrives. So here's what you became. Independent, but not isolated. You value autonomy because you grew up with it. You don't need constant contact to feel secure. But you also understand the importance of real connection, the kind you had to work to maintain before it became automatic. You're skeptical, but not cynical. You saw enough broken promises and systemic failures to know that optimism without caution is naive. But you also remember what it felt like to believe things could be good, and you haven't fully let go of that. You're digitally fluent, but analog rooted. You can work remotely, build a brand online, navigate social media. But you also remember life before all of this, and you know it's not necessary in the way younger generations think it is. You can unplug, and when you do, you don't feel like you're missing something essential. You feel like you're remembering something true. You can hold contradictions without falling apart. And that's rare. Most people need the world to be one thing or the other. They need to believe the old way was better or the new way is better. They need to commit to a narrative. But you don't. Because you lived the transition. You don't have to choose. You contain both. You're not torn between worlds. You're fluent in both. And that fluency is a strength people don't have a name for yet. But here's the cost. You don't fully belong anywhere. Gen X sees you as too young. You didn't grow up with their cynicism, their MTV, their early 90s grunge. You missed the cultural markers that define them. Millennials see you as too old. You didn't grow up with social media. You didn't have a smartphone in high school. You don't have the same relationship to visibility, performance, and online identity that they do. You're in between. And being in between is psychologically exhausting in ways that don't get talked about enough. You don't have a clear generational identity. You don't get the nostalgia wave that Gen X gets. You don't get the think pieces that try to understand millennials. You're just in the gap. And the gap is quiet. You've probably felt it, the sense that you're too late for something and too early for something else, that you missed both boats, that the culture isn't speaking to you, isn't reflecting you, isn't trying to sell to you or understand you or define you. And in a weird way, that made you self-reliant. Because if no one is telling you who you are, you have to figure it out yourself. But it also made you tired. Tired of translating. Tired of explaining. Tired of being the person who remembers what it was like before, but also has to keep up with what's happening now. You're the translator at every family gathering, the bridge in every workplace, the one who can speak both languages but belongs to neither country. And that weight is real. It's a specific kind of fatigue that comes from never fully being seen by the culture around you. But understanding the cost is the first step to understanding that it wasn't for nothing. But here's what I want you to understand. This isn't a flaw. This is adaptive intelligence. You didn't just survive a transition, you absorbed it. You integrated it. You rewired in real time while your brain was still forming, and you came out the other side functional. That's not common. Most systems break when you change the rules halfway through, but you didn't. You adjusted. You learned two languages, two ways of being, two completely different models for how connection and identity and meaning work, and you made them both fit inside you. You are a living bridge between two eras, and that makes you valuable in ways that won't be fully understood for another decade. Because as the world keeps changing, and it will keep changing, faster, the people who survive won't be the ones who resist change or the ones who only know change. It'll be the people who remember what it was like before and can still adapt to what comes next. It'll be the people who can hold two things at once, and that's you. You know how to be present because you were raised in presence, but you also know how to navigate a world that never stops moving. You know how to be alone because you learned that solitude isn't emptiness, but you also know how to connect across distance in ways that earlier generations never had access to. You don't need the internet to have a sense of self, but you're not afraid of it either. You're not stuck in the past, and you're not lost in the future. You exist in the rare, uncomfortable, incredibly useful space of being able to live in both. So if you've ever felt like you don't quite fit, like you're too old for one thing and too young for another, like the world moved on without pausing to check if you were ready, you're right. It did. But you moved with it. And you didn't lose yourself in the process. That's not a small thing. That's the whole thing. You were born between two worlds, and instead of breaking, you became the bridge. If this felt like something you've thought but never heard out loud, leave a comment. And if you want more psychology that actually speaks to the things no one else is naming, subscribe. You're not in between. You're both. And that was always the point.